The first cold winds of October swept across the Montana prairie, bending the tall golden grass until it rippled like waves beneath an endless blue sky. The Hayes Ranch stretched across miles of rolling land, bordered by cottonwood trees and a narrow creek that shimmered beneath the morning sun. Abigail Hayes had lived there her entire life. At 28, she knew every trail, every fence post, and every bend in the creek as well as she knew the lines on her own hands. Life had not been easy since her mother, Rose Hayes, died nearly 20 years earlier. Her father, Thomas Hayes, rarely spoke of that terrible autumn night. Instead, he buried himself in work, raising cattle and repairing the ranch piece by piece. Over the years, Abigail learned to do the same. She became the quiet strength of the ranch, managing livestock, repairing fences, balancing accounts, and making sure everything continued running whenever her father traveled to nearby towns for cattle sales. This particular week, Thomas had taken a herd north to Helena, leaving Abigail alone except for two aging ranch hands who worked only during daylight hours. The eastern pasture had suffered heavy damage after several days of rain, and before breakfast Abigail saddled her chestnut mare, Daisy, to inspect the broken fence line. The prairie was unusually peaceful that morning. Hawks circled high overhead, while distant elk grazed near the foothills. Abigail welcomed the silence. It allowed her mind to wander toward dreams she rarely admitted aloud. She often imagined restoring the old apple orchard her mother had planted years before. The neglected trees still stood on the northern edge of the property, their twisted branches reaching toward the sky like forgotten memories. Everyone said it was too much work for too little reward, but Abigail never stopped believing the orchard could bloom again. She reached the eastern creek shortly after sunrise. Something unusual caught Daisy's attention first. The horse stopped suddenly, ears standing straight. "What is it, girl?" Abigail asked softly. Following Daisy's gaze, she noticed another horse standing perfectly still near the creek bank. It was a magnificent black gelding with a worn saddle and dusty reins dragging across the grass. Instead of running away, the animal remained beside something lying in the weeds. Abigail urged Daisy forward cautiously. As she drew closer, her heart skipped. A man lay face down beside the water. His hat rested several feet away. One arm stretched toward it as though he had collapsed trying to reach it. His clothes were soaked from the previous night's rainstorm, and dried blood marked the side of his forehead. She dismounted immediately. Her father had taught her years ago never to panic during an emergency. "Start with what you know," he always said. She knelt beside the stranger. He was breathing. His pulse was weak but steady. One shoulder appeared badly twisted, and bruises covered his arms. His skin burned with fever, even though the morning air remained cool. Whoever he was, he had spent the entire night exposed to the cold. Abigail searched for serious wounds, but found none beyond the head injury and damaged shoulder. Relief washed over her. With rest and proper care, he might survive. As she lifted part of the saddle to loosen its straps, something carved into the leather caught her eye. A familiar emblem. An old oak tree, surrounded by a circle with two crossed horseshoes beneath it. Her breath caught. The Carter family crest. She stared at it for several long moments. The Carters, her father's oldest enemies. Ever since childhood, she had heard the stories. Thomas Hayes believed William Carter's family was responsible for the fire that destroyed their old barn and claimed Rose Hayes's life. Since that night, neither family crossed onto the other's land unless absolutely necessary. Abigail slowly looked back at the unconscious cowboy. He couldn't have been much older than 30. Despite the famous family mark, there was nothing threatening about him now. Fever had stripped away every ounce of pride. He looked exhausted, vulnerable, and completely alone. She considered riding into town for help. The nearest doctor lived over an hour away. By the time she returned, it might already be too late. The wind stirred through the cottonwoods. Her mother had once told her that kindness revealed who a person truly was when no one else was watching. Abigail sighed. "It doesn't matter whose son you are," she whispered. "You're hurt." Decision made. She spent nearly half an hour maneuvering the unconscious man onto Daisy, while leading the black gelding behind them. It was exhausting work, and more than once she nearly lost her balance beneath his weight. By the time they reached an abandoned shepherd's cabin on the edge of the property, sweat soaked through her jacket despite the cool weather. Inside, the cabin was simple but dry. There was an old wooden cot, a stone fireplace, a rain barrel outside, and enough firewood stacked beneath the porch to last several days. She cleaned the stranger's wounds, wrapped his shoulder tightly, and started a fire. Through the long afternoon, she boiled water, prepared broth, and cooled his fever with damp cloths. He never fully woke, though occasionally he murmured words she couldn't understand. As evening settled across the prairie, Abigail stepped outside. The setting sun painted the mountains deep shades of crimson and gold. The stranger's horse grazed peacefully nearby, never wandering far from the cabin. She couldn't stop thinking about that saddle brand. If her father returned unexpectedly and discovered a carter resting under their roof, there would be consequences neither of them could predict. Still, looking back through the cabin window, she saw not an enemy, but a wounded man fighting to survive. For now, that was all that mattered. Neither Abigail nor the unconscious cowboy realized that one simple act of mercy, made beside a lonely creek on an ordinary autumn morning, had already begun changing the fate of two families whose hatred had lasted for nearly 20 years. Samuel Carter remained unconscious for 2 full days. Abigail barely left the shepherd's cabin except to fetch fresh water or tend to the horses. Every few hours, she replaced the damp cloth on his forehead, checked the bandage around his shoulder, and coaxed a few spoonfuls of broth between his lips whenever he stirred. Fever came and went in restless waves. Sometimes he muttered names she had never heard. Other times he reached into empty air as though trying to stop someone from leaving. On the second night, the fever finally began to break. Just before dawn, Abigail woke in the wooden chair beside the cot. She realized someone was watching her. Samuel's gray eyes were half open. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. He looked confused, trying to remember where he was. "You finally decided to wake up," Abigail said with a small smile. His voice was rough from dehydration. "Am I still alive?" "Barely." He attempted to sit upright, but immediately winced. "Don't. I've had worse." "I doubt that." She handed him a cup of warm broth. "You've been unconscious for 2 days." Samuel accepted the cup with his uninjured hand, but struggled to hold it steady. Abigail quietly helped support it without making him feel embarrassed. After taking a few careful sips, he looked around the cabin. "Where am I?" "An old shepherd's cabin on Hayes Ranch." "You brought me here? You and your horse?" A faint smile crossed his face. "I suppose I owe you my life." "You owe me nothing." "I disagree." Abigail shrugged. "I only did what anyone should." Samuel studied her for a moment. "I've traveled across 3 territories," he said quietly. "Not everyone would have." She had no answer for that. Instead, she changed the subject. "What's your name?" "Samuel Carter." The surname hung in the air between them. If he noticed her brief hesitation, he said nothing. "And yours?" "Abigail Hayes." He nodded politely, completely unaware of the history tied to their names. Over the next week, Samuel slowly recovered. His shoulder remained stiff, forcing him to rely mostly on his left arm. But each morning he looked stronger than the day before. Despite Abigail's insistence that he rest, Samuel disliked sitting idle. One afternoon she found him outside trying to split firewood one-handed. "You've lost your mind," she called. "I was only helping. You were making more work for me. I don't enjoy being useless." She folded her arms. "You'll be truly useless if that shoulder tears again." Samuel laughed quietly. "You're impossible." "So I've been told." He obediently put the axe down. From then on, he found smaller ways to help. He swept the cabin floor, repaired broken hinges, cleaned saddles, mended harness straps. Once his shoulder improved, Abigail finally allowed him to accompany her to the damaged eastern fence. They worked side by side beneath clear autumn skies. She held each fence post steady while Samuel packed fresh earth around the base. They settled into an easy rhythm. Conversation came naturally. He told her about growing up far from Montana after his father sent him to live with relatives in Pine Hollow. Horses had become his livelihood, and he spent years breeding and training them before returning earlier that spring to care for his aging father. "I've spent most of this year learning this country all over again," Samuel admitted. "It feels familiar, but different." Abigail understood. The land remembers even when people don't. He smiled. "I like the way you think." As the days passed, Abigail found herself looking forward to their mornings together. Samuel possessed none of the bitterness she expected from a carter. He thanked her for every meal, never complained, never boasted. Whenever something needed fixing, he quietly picked up the tools without being asked. One afternoon, while repairing a section of fence overlooking the valley, Samuel became unusually quiet. "My little sister loved places like this," he finally said. Abigail looked toward him. "What was her name?" "Lucy." He stared across the hills. "She died when she was 8. "I'm sorry." "So was I." He rested both hands on the fence rail. "I was only 12. We were inseparable." Abigail waited. After a long silence, Samuel continued. "I still don't know exactly what happened. My father never talks about that night. I've asked him dozens of times. He always changes the subject. There are pieces missing." Abigail felt her stomach tighten. She knew exactly which night he meant, but she remained silent. Instead, she asked softly, "Do you think you'll ever learn the truth?" Samuel looked toward the distant mountains. "I have to. If I don't, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering." His quiet determination lingered in Abigail's thoughts long after they returned to the cabin. A few days later, Samuel insisted on accompanying her into Silver Creek to purchase supplies. The little frontier town bustled with wagons, merchants, and ranchers preparing for winter. At the general store, Abigail gathered flour, coffee, lamp oil, and seed sacks. When she reached the counter, she noticed 2 extra jars of her homemade apple preserves among the purchases. "I didn't pick those." Samuel smiled. "I did. You don't have to buy my preserves. I've tasted them. They're worth every penny." She laughed. "You're saying that because I saved your life. I'm saying it because they're the best preserves I've ever had." The old shopkeeper chuckled. "I've been telling her that for years." Samuel paid before Abigail could argue. As they stepped outside, he handed her one of the jars. "This one's for your pantry. You just bought it." "I know. You made it." "I know that too." She shook her head, smiling despite herself. They walked their horses through the quiet streets before heading home. Halfway back, they stopped on a ridge overlooking the valley. Below them stretched both ranches, separated only by open grassland and a narrow spring winding through the center. Samuel pointed toward the distant water. "My father says our family once shared that spring with another ranch." Abigail's heart skipped. "Really?" Before some disagreement divided everyone. He frowned thoughtfully. "I don't know what happened, but I'd like to." She looked toward the fading sunlight reflecting across the valley. For the first time in years, she found herself wondering whether everything she had been taught about the Carter family was truly the whole story. As the golden light settled over the prairie, neither of them spoke. They simply stood together, watching the endless Montana horizon, unaware that the feelings quietly growing between them would soon force both families to confront a truth buried for nearly 20 years. Thomas Hayes returned to the ranch 3 days earlier than expected. Abigail was repairing a wagon wheel near the barn when she heard the familiar rumble of hooves approaching from the western trail. She looked up with a smile, expecting to welcome her father home with good news about the repaired fences and healthy cattle. Instead, her smile disappeared. Samuel was riding beside her. He had insisted on helping drive a pair of loose horses back from the northern pasture, unaware that Thomas could arrive at any moment. Thomas pulled his horse to a stop in the middle of the yard. His tired expression vanished the instant his eyes settled on Samuel's saddle. The carved Carter emblem was impossible to miss. For several long seconds, complete silence filled the ranch. Then Thomas climbed down from his horse. "What is he doing here?" His voice was calm, but Abigail recognized the anger hidden beneath it. "Father, I asked you a question." Samuel dismounted respectfully. "My name is Samuel Carter, sir. I know exactly who you are." Thomas's jaw tightened. I should have recognized that saddle from half a mile away. Abigail quickly stepped between them. He was injured. I found him by the eastern creek. He would have died if I left him there. Thomas never looked away from Samuel. You should have. Father, he belongs to the family that destroyed ours. Samuel frowned with genuine confusion. I don't understand. Thomas pointed toward the old barn. 20 years ago, your father burned that place to the ground. My wife died in those flames. My mother. Abigail's heart pounded. She had never heard him speak about that night with such raw emotion. Samuel removed his hat. I'm deeply sorry for your loss. But I swear to you, I didn't know. You expect me to believe that? I do. My father never told me any of this. Thomas laughed bitterly. Convenient. It's the truth. Abigail looked from one man to the other. For the first time, she realized they were both carrying wounds they didn't fully understand. Samuel spoke carefully. I was 12 when my sister Lucy died. My father sent me away shortly afterward. I grew up in Pine Hollow. I only returned this spring. I've been asking him what happened that night ever since. He refuses to answer. Thomas stared at him. You mean he never admitted it? Samuel slowly shook his head. He barely speaks about that night at all. The older rancher hesitated, only for a moment. Then years of anger hardened his face once again. I don't care what story he tells now. The damage is done. Samuel lowered his eyes. I understand why you hate my family, but I can't live with questions anymore. If my father truly caused your wife's death, I need to hear it from him. Without another word, Samuel mounted his horse. He looked once toward Abigail. I'm sorry, not because he believed himself guilty, but because he knew the pain carried by both families had suddenly become his own. He turned south toward the Carter homestead. William Carter was repairing leather tack inside the barn when Samuel arrived. His father looked older than he remembered. Gray had replaced much of the dark hair beneath his hat, and years of hard work had bent his shoulders. You came back early, William said. Samuel remained standing. I met Thomas Hayes today. The leather slipped from William's hands. Neither man spoke. Finally, Samuel broke the silence. He believes you murdered his wife. William closed his eyes. So, it finally found you. No, it finally found us. Samuel stepped closer. I've spent months asking what happened. You owe me the truth. William sat heavily on a wooden crate. For several minutes, only the wind could be heard moving through the cracks of the old barn. Then he began. I rode to Hayes Ranch that evening to end an argument, not start one. Samuel frowned. What argument? The spring. We'd been fighting over water for years. I finally decided enough was enough. I wanted peace. He looked toward the open doorway as memories returned. A storm rolled across the valley before I arrived. Lightning struck an old cottonwood beside their barn. The dry roof caught fire almost instantly. Samuel listened without interrupting. I ran inside to free the horses. I never saw Lucy follow me. William's voice began to shake. She loved animals. She heard them screaming. She ran into the barn before I could stop her. He swallowed hard. Then Rose Hayes saw Lucy disappear inside. Samuel slowly sat opposite his father. Rose went after her? William nodded. Without hesitation. I shouted for both of them. I found Lucy. I reached Rose. But in the confusion, his hands trembled. I knocked over an oil lantern. The flames spread faster. The roof began collapsing. I pushed them toward the door, but a support beam came down between us. His eyes filled with tears. I tried. God knows I tried. I couldn't reach them. Silence settled over the barn. Samuel finally whispered, You didn't start the fire. William slowly shook his head. But I helped make it worse. And I walked out while they didn't. When Thomas accused me the next morning, I couldn't defend myself. I blamed myself. I believed I deserved every word he said. William reached into an old wooden chest. From inside, he removed a scorched silver locket. Its edges remained blackened by fire despite the passing years. Open it. Samuel carefully lifted the lid. Inside rested a faded photograph. Rose Hayes sat beneath a cottonwood tree. Beside her stood little Lucy Carter. laughing with one arm wrapped around Rose's shoulders as if they were mother and daughter. Samuel stared in disbelief. They knew each other. They loved each other, William answered softly. Rose treated Lucy like family. I carried this every day because it reminded me of both the woman I couldn't save and the daughter I lost. Samuel closed the locket with trembling hands. 20 years of hatred, built on silence instead of truth. He rose to his feet. I'm taking this to Thomas Hayes. William nodded. He deserves to know. As Samuel rode back toward Hayes Ranch beneath the fading evening sky, the silver locket rested safely inside his coat. He knew the truth alone would not erase 2 decades of grief. But somewhere beyond the rolling prairie, one family waited with anger, another waited with regret, and both stood on the edge of discovering that the greatest enemy they had ever faced was not fire, but silence. Samuel returned to Hayes Ranch just before sunset the following evening. The silver locket rested safely inside his coat pocket, but it felt far heavier than its size should have allowed. Every mile across the prairie had given him more time to think, yet no amount of reflection made the conversation ahead seem easier. Abigail was feeding the horses when she saw him ride through the front gate. She hurried toward him. You came back. I said I would. She searched his face. You know the truth now. Samuel nodded. I know enough. Is my father here? In the house. Samuel looked toward the porch where Thomas sat alone, staring across the pasture with a cup of untouched coffee. The older rancher hadn't moved for nearly an hour. I need to speak with him. Abigail hesitated only a moment before leading Samuel inside. Thomas didn't stand when Samuel entered. I thought I told you not to come back. You did. But I came anyway. Thomas looked at him with tired eyes. I don't have anything left to say. Samuel slowly removed the scorched silver locket and placed it on the kitchen table. I didn't come to argue. I came to finish a story that should have been told 20 years ago. Thomas glanced at the blackened locket. What is that? My father's greatest regret. He carefully opened it. Thomas leaned forward. The moment he saw the faded photograph, all the color drained from his face. Rose, his wife, standing beside little Lucy Carter with both of them smiling beneath the old cottonwood tree that had once shaded the original barn. He remembered that summer perfectly. Rose often watched Lucy whenever William was away working cattle. The little girl had practically become family. Thomas closed the locket with trembling fingers. She loved that child. Samuel quietly nodded. And Lucy loved her. Neither man spoke for several moments. Finally, Samuel explained everything exactly as William had told him. The lightning strike, the burning barn, the terrified horses, Lucy running inside, Rose following without hesitation, the fallen lantern, the collapsing roof, his father's desperate attempt to save them both. When he finished, silence filled the room once again. Thomas slowly lowered his head. So, he didn't set the fire. No, he made mistakes. He carried guilt, but he never intended for any of it to happen. Thomas rubbed his weathered hands together. I spent 20 years hating him. Samuel answered honestly. My father spent 20 years hating himself. Those simple words seemed to reach somewhere deeper than any accusation ever could. Thomas stared out the window toward the distant hills. I should have asked more questions. Samuel gently shook his head. My father should have answered them. Abigail looked between the two men. For the first time since childhood, she saw the anger leaving her father's face. Not disappearing, simply growing tired. Before Samuel left, Thomas spoke quietly. Tell your father. He paused. Tell him I'm willing to hear the rest from him. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a beginning. 3 mornings later, William Carter walked alone to Hayes Ranch. He left his horse tied beneath a cottonwood nearly half a mile away. He wanted no quick escape if the conversation went badly. Thomas met him beside the old fence. Neither man carried a rifle. Neither wore a revolver. Only years of sorrow. William removed his hat. I've rehearsed this speech 1,000 times. It never sounded right. Thomas waited silently. I didn't start that fire, William said, but I kept the truth buried because I believed I deserved your hatred. I was ashamed. I was proud. And every year that passed made speaking harder. He looked directly into Thomas's eyes. "I'm not asking you to forget. I'm asking you to know what really happened." Thomas studied him for what felt like forever. Finally, he spoke. "My wife ran into that barn because she refused to let a child die alone." William's voice cracked. "I know. I've thanked God for her courage every day since." The two old ranchers stood without speaking while the autumn wind moved through the prairie grass. At last, Thomas reached forward and slowly unlatched the old wooden gate separating both properties. It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't complete forgiveness. It was simply permission to stop standing on opposite sides. William stepped through. That single step ended 20 years of silence. As winter approached, small changes began to appear across the valley. Thomas and William reopened the forgotten spring that had once divided their families. Together they cleared fallen branches, repaired the stone banks, and built a shared watering place for both ranches. Abigail suggested planting 2 young cottonwood trees nearby, one for Rose and one for Lucy. Neither father argued. They planted them side by side beneath the clear Montana sky. Snow came and went. The seasons slowly softened old wounds. Thomas occasionally invited William to share coffee after long days repairing fences. William helped restore the neglected apple orchard Rose had dreamed of seeing flourish again. Samuel worked beside Abigail nearly every day. Their friendship had quietly become something neither of them could deny. One crisp spring morning, Samuel led Abigail to the ridge overlooking both ranches. Wildflowers covered the hillsides. Below them, the 2 young trees swayed beside the sparkling waters of Silver Creek. "This is where everything changed," Samuel said. Abigail smiled. "No. It changed the morning I found an injured stranger beside the creek." Samuel laughed softly. "You're probably right." He reached into his coat and removed a small velvet box. "I don't want to marry you because our fathers finally made peace. I want to marry you because every sunrise is better when you're standing beside me, because every trail feels shorter with you, and because I can't imagine building my future without you." Tears filled Abigail's eyes before she even answered. "Then you shouldn't imagine it. I'll marry you." They embraced as the spring breeze carried the scent of blooming apple blossoms across the valley. Several weeks later, the wedding took place beside Silver Creek, exactly where the shared spring crossed the land between both ranches. It wasn't held on Hayes property. It wasn't held on Carter land. It belonged equally to both families. Thomas placed Abigail's hand into Samuel's without hesitation. William stood proudly beside his son, his eyes shining with quiet gratitude. Nearby, the 2 young cottonwood trees stretched their fresh green branches toward the bright Montana sky. Years later, travelers passing through the valley would see 2 thriving ranches sharing one stream, one orchard, and one peaceful future. Few of them would ever know that everything began because a young ranch woman chose compassion over hatred when she found a wounded stranger lying alone beside a lonely creek. Sometimes history isn't changed by great battles or famous men. Sometimes it changes because one person decides that kindness matters more than old grudges, and that the truth, no matter how long it has been buried, is always worth bringing into the light.